Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So welcome to my channel and welcome to my movie fight reviews. Today we're looking at The Man in the Iron Mask from 1998, famously starring Leonardo DiCaprio in the eponymous role, in fact playing both the King and the Man in the Iron Mask. And good array of actors. I actually think it's a pretty decent film. It doesn't get the best ratings in the world. If you look at reviews, it's critics' reviews, but I think it's a pretty decent film actually, quite a well put together story. The fighting in it, and that's what we're going to be focusing on here today, is fairly standard Hollywood theatrical fight fare, but that's what we'll talk about a bit in this video. The people you'll see fighting, apart from the extras, dressed as assorted musketeers, are indeed John Malkovich, Gerard Depardieu, we've got Gabriel Byrne and Jeremy Irons. So it's got a good lineup of actors, and as I say, the choreography is actually fairly typical of rapier type combat as we see in lots of Hollywood films, and we'll be talking about some of the pitfalls that that people fall into when they choreograph fights with this type of weapon. Now first up, just before I go into actually reviewing the fight itself, and this is pretty much one of the climatic fights of the movie, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen the film and you want to watch it, it's 1998's The Man in the Iron Mask, then watch the film first and then watch this video. But before talking about the actual fight itself, just a little word about rapiers. So there's some very common misconceptions about rapiers. The headlines of what I want to impress upon you with rapiers is they are thrust-centric swords. That is, they are excellent thrusting weapons, but they can cut. Okay, so there's something that a lot of people assume about rapiers, is they are only thrusting weapons. Of course, they can cut and thrust. However, they are not very good at cutting. And with most rapiers, at least, you can't cut hardly at all, negligible amount, in the last foot of blade. If you want to cut someone, you have to cut pretty much down here most of the time. There are rapier treatises that talk about the cutting with the centre of percussion, as it's called, so that is this portion of the blade up here. However, it's really dependent on the type of rapier you're using. I'm not going to talk too much about the rapier hilts. I'm holding a swept hilt here, which doesn't offer a huge amount of hand protection, but certainly better than earlier period swords. What you will see typically in lots of musketeer films is the use of cup hilts, and cup hilts are easier to make. That's one of the reasons they're used a lot in Hollywood. They're easier and cheaper to make, but they do additionally offer a better level of hand protection, at least in rapier fencing. Swept hilts are debatably better at protecting against things like backswords and broadswords and maybe pole weapons, halberds, things like this. But the main point I want to make is that rapiers are not light. Okay, this is not a fencing foil. It's not a modern fencing épée or foil. It is a heavy weapon. This weighs 1,300 grams, and this is modelled exactly on one in the Wallace collection, on an original from about 1630-ish. So this that I'm holding in my hands is made by Marco Dinelli of Dinelli Armories, and it is sort of roughly equivalent to the sort of swords that we're seeing represented in musketeer movies. And it is not a light weapon. It is heavier, in fact, than many sabres. It is heavier than lots of medieval one-handed swords. So the rapier is a heavy weapon, but it's long. It's very long and very thrust-centric. So what you're gaining for that weight is reach. So it's a very long weapon. You've got a lot of reach with it, and you've got a good level of hand protection as well. So I want you to bear in mind those things when you're watching this fight. It's a long weapon, it can't cut very well, and it's not light. It's a fairly weighty weapon, and it takes quite a lot of strength to actually use it. Right, now let's actually start to look at the fight. So our four heroes, the four musketeers, have been cornered in a room essentially, and they're being attacked by musketeers under the king's orders. So let's have a look and see what we can see. So first up there, we have a very nice representation of the use of firearms within the context of a sword fight. And of course, as soon as we get into the 17th century definitely, we could debatably say even the 16th century, the beginnings of, but really the 17th century onwards, so 17th, 18th and 19th and even into the 20th century, swords functioned in a world where firearms were obviously very prominent. However, in this period, in the 17th century, we're dealing with dog locks and wheel locks, and they're all pretty much all muzzle-loaded firearms. That means they're slow to reload. So you fire your gun, and in this kind of scenario where you're in hand-to-hand combat range, you fire your firearm, in this case a wheel lock pistol, I think most of them were using. You fire your wheel lock pistol, and then it's basically useless as a firearm. Now, that's not to say it's useless as a hand-to-hand combat object. In actual fact, they were used sometimes in close combat, and if you noticed, if you Google, for example, wheel lock pistol, you'll see that a lot of them from the 17th century actually have a large ball pommel, much like a sword of the period. So you can use it as a sort of club, and they were used as clubs, and indeed they were occasionally used in the offhand. So if you've got a sword in your main hand, you might fire with your pistol in your left hand and then turn it around, so you're holding the muzzle now with the sort of hook of the grip at the far end, and you can actually use it as a parrying device. They don't do that here, which I think is a bit of a shame, although in fairness most of them have daggers, have left-hand daggers. So if you have a rapier and a dagger, then clearly you don't need the pistol in close combat, so it's completely valid. You fire your pistols however you choose to aim. They have various aiming methods shown in this film. I won't talk about that, maybe something for a future video. But they fire off their pistols, that pistol's essentially now redundant, throw it away, and in fact many cavalry in this period carried 2 or even more, sometimes 4 wheel lock pistols carried in holsters either side of their horse's saddle, essentially, just in front of the saddle. And they would fire off the pistols, and they'd basically, and sometimes they'd have a carbine as well, they'd fire off their firearms, and if there wasn't a chance to reload, they would simply either reholster them or drop them and draw the sword and then go in with the sword. So in this case they've fired off the pistols, they've been expended, they've drawn their swords because that's the sensible thing to do. And you've got to remember, in any discussion, certainly in this period and really until the mid-19th century, with a firearm that can't produce more shots without reloading, in very many cases in history, the logical next step was either a sword or a bayonet. Now, bayonets hadn't quite been invented by this point, they were just starting to experiment with plug bayonets, but by and large, the sword was the backup weapon to the firearm in the 17th century. So let's carry on and see what happens next in the fight. Right, so here we have the classic movie rapier combat that I want to talk about in this video, and that is, we have here a weapon that's long and is balanced towards the hand, and you'll notice despite the fact that it weighs about 3 pounds or 1,300 grams, I can very nimbly and easily move that tip around wherever I want because of the weight distribution and point of balance of this weapon. So the point is very nimble, despite the fact it's a heavy weapon, and I can parry heavy weapons with it because it's got mass to do so. I can move my tip around very nimbly, and that's what you want with a thrust-centric weapon. What we see here is they're rushing into combat, and really, if you're rushing into combat with a rapier, you should be going in whatever guard with the point presented, okay? Because that is your main form of attack. And what a lot of these, both extras and the main lead actors do, is they charge in and they go, ah, and lift up the weapon. I've got to be careful because of my ceiling here, but they lift their weapon up to give an almighty great blow with their sword. And this is not, although this might be a natural behaviour for humans, because it is very natural for people, whether they're using a knife or a stick or a sword, to go ah like this and just to hit when they're under stress. These are supposed to be the best trained swordsmen in France in the 17th century. They should know that if you're going to go in with a rapier, you're going to be going in most of the time with the point forward, because that is your most lethal attack and your longest reaching attack, and that's very important. If you're closing with someone who also has a weapon of similar length to you, you're not going to want to give up your reach advantage by lifting your weapon up to cut if they're just presenting their point towards you. Okay, so it's really a classic movie thing, a Hollywood thing of wanting to show the biggest, most dramatic action, and there's probably a degree of safety involved as well, of course. To give this kind of big telegraphed, as we call it, cut is safer than to have two actors charging at each other with their points forward. Okay, so it's classic difference between movie fighting, stage fighting, theatrical fighting, and real rapier combat. Essentially, they're chopping a lot with their rapiers when they should be thrusting a lot. Let's go back to the fight. So there we just saw two occasions where John Malkovich has a rapier in his left hand, and now my normal criticism of this would be that he's doing a lot of stuff with his sword and he's just kind of holding the dagger there. He's not really doing very much with the dagger, and I would usually say, you know, when he's kind of wrapping his arm around people or shoving them or pushing them with his fist and all this kind of stuff, he should really be shanking them, he should be stabbing them. And very often you wouldn't be defending always with the sword. Sometimes you defend with the sword, take over with the dagger, and that would free your sword up to then attack again with the sword. Sometimes you might attack with the rapier and the sword together, and sometimes you might even defend just with the dagger and attack simultaneously with the sword. Now the reason that I'm not going to criticise it in this fight is very specifically, these are ex-musketeers in some cases, and musketeers trying not to kill as many of the other musketeers. So it's a particular feature of the story of the movie whereby they're trying not to kill that many of the musketeers who are attacking them. So I'm going to forgive them this time, in that when he's got the left-hand dagger in his hand and he's just sort of wrapping around and grappling and pushing and stuff with his hand, I'm going to forgive that, because I'm going to go, yeah, he's trying not to wound or kill that many of his former comrades. Okay, let's move on with the fight. Right, there we saw, I believe it was Gerard Depardieu using a cloak, and the use of the cloak or cape I've talked about in previous videos. It was indeed used a lot in the period of the rapier. If you're dealing with very thrust-centric fencing styles, actually the cape used as shown there as a sort of drape, almost like a net, is quite a useful thing, both to throw over a person, but equally to throw over their weapon or their weapon arm, to impede the use of their weapon. So yeah, it's quite well done there, and the only thing I would really add is that when you're opposing cuts, it was traditional to wrap the cape around your arm so you could actually absorb the force of cuts, because the cuts aren't going to pass through many layers of wool fabric that the cloak is made of. So, but that's not really relevant to this fight. To this fight, he's using it more or less. There's nothing technical there, but it's representative of the fact that capes or cloaks were used with rapiers, and they are talked about in fencing treatises of the period. Let's move along. Right, so several times in this fight we've seen what I would call very superficial slashes given to people, and the people fall down going, "Ugh!" like they're completely out of action. A lot of these slashes simply wouldn't, certainly not from a rapier, wouldn't put a person out of action. The blade is narrow, and the geometry of the blade, because it has to be relatively stiff to be an effective thrusting blade, means that these swords do not cut very effectively. Yes, you can give what we call a push cut, or you can give a draw cut, and of course you can give a standard hack as well. However, a lot of the cuts that they're showing here wouldn't put a person out of action. They wouldn't lead to a person going, "Ah," and then just falling down on the ground. Instead, they'd lead to a person going, "Ah," like that, blood coming out, and then they would carry on fighting. Most of these wounds are not wounds that would put a person out of action. Now, we could say they're giving those kind of superficial wounds because they're trying not to kill that many of their musketeer compadres, But then we saw what we just saw there. We just saw someone completely run through. So clearly they're not that worried about killing their opposing musketeers, because they are stabbing some of them with both their swords and their daggers occasionally. So there's a little bit of inconsistency in the fight. But let's carry on watching. Right, I'm basically going to stop it there because that's the end of that particular fight scene. I do like that it finished off, certainly from a narrative point of view, it finished off showing that someone being held with the point presented for the coup de grace, or the killing blow, and then it wasn't given, because it's reminding us all the way through that fight that they're trying to defeat their opponents without killing all of them. So actually, my conclusion, without whittering on forever about it, my conclusion for this fight is that it was pretty much standard rapier combat in a theatrical Hollywood way, but a little bit above the average of the grade. They do hack a little bit much, they cut a bit too much. In one instance we even saw someone bring two hands up to their rapier to give a sort of longsword cut or bastard sword cut with their rapier, which is just nonsensical. That's just a silly thing to do with a rapier. Not saying it never happened, who knows, all sorts of things might have happened, but certainly it's not the norm and it's not usually how you would use a rapier. There was, generally speaking, too much cutting, too much flailing, there wasn't enough use of the point. However, I have to say, we did see the point used, and very often when the point was used, it was for a killing blow. And you could say in the narrative that all of those cuts and slashes that were done to incapacitate rather than to kill, because they were trying not to kill that many of their former comrades and friends. So by and large, I think this was a good movie fight. I think the choreography was okay. It was roughly representative of the period. The rapiers were used some of the time, sort of like rapiers would be used, if not exactly. They used a cape, they used left-hand daggers, even if not particularly technically or very much. And ultimately, I think perhaps most importantly to a movie, they kept the narrative true from beginning to end. From beginning to end, when they pull their pistols out, they say, shoot to wound, and that's very clear that the director kept a good straight vision of what that fight was supposed to show. It was supposed to show 4 ex-musketeers or renegades who'd been caught in a corner and had to fight to protect their own lives and didn't want to kill that many of their opponents because they didn't regard their opponents as bad or, you know, of necessarily ill will, but they had to fight them, they had to stop them to protect their own lives. So I think that they kept a true narrative through the fight. So by and large, I would say The Man in the Iron Mask, 1998, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jeremy Irons and John Malkovich and others, is a fairly good film, and I actually think the fights in it are fairly good. They could have been better, as always, but they weren't bad, and I would say they were slightly above the average. So I would give the Matt movie fight review for fighting alone, for nothing else, but for fighting alone, I would give it a 7 out of 10. Cheers, folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.